This question gets into some of the things that we've talked about already in the course, but also gets into some of the things that I asked you to read today for Chapter 4 of Jannet, so we'll be getting more into some of the details here. I want to kind of start with a finger poll. So 1 is very easy, 5 is very difficult. How challenging did you find this question to complete? Okay. So a lot of people in kind of the 2 to 3 range. That's great. So if you feel pretty good about this question and have a good knowledge of this topic, that's great. You can think about this kind of as a check-in on how you're doing so far in the class with following readings and other class material. So as a reminder, the exam is going to be half short essay and half multiple choice. It's between November 3rd and 5th, so that'll be 2 weeks from Wednesday. So in terms of preparing and doing well on the exam, right, you might think about how if it's 2 hours, you have about half the time to focus on the 25 multiple choice questions. The other half, right, there'll be 4 options for the short essay. You'll pick 3 of those. That translates into about 20 minutes per question. So you can expect to see questions like these where they're broken up into different parts. So for instance, culture and its relationship to conflict. So we can start here with defining culture. Is there anybody who'd like to take a stab at what culture is?
I was going to say what I wrote down was culture is like the traditions, values, and parts of the society that influence everyday decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good and pretty thorough definition, right? So culture gets at all of these different elements that make us who we are, right? So one thing that we see some discussion about is the role that ethnicity or nationality might play in culture. For instance, some people might see their nationality, right, if they were born in the United States, as a really big part of their identity. That might not be as large of a part of your culture, right? As we grow up and form relationships with other people, right, we become members of different cultures and different groups. So culture might include our family heritage, our family background. It might include some of the communities, sports, other extracurriculars that you might do, and the people that you interact with on a regular basis. So culture kind of captures a lot of things. But one thing that makes culture really unique, right, is its own set of rules and practices. So for instance, the holidays that you choose to celebrate with your family or friends, right, are oftentimes reflected on the unique culture that you might come from. One class that explores a lot of these issues in more detail is intercultural communication. Dr. Chen in communication teaches a couple of those courses, so it's definitely a course if you're more interested in looking at culture and how members of different cultures communicate, you can look into. So Kimberly comes from a more collectivist culture. Nancy comes from a more individualistic culture. So how might they approach conflict differently? So there's a few different approaches that you could take here. Does anybody want to talk through what they had here for this response? Yeah.
I said like Nancy are probably more like kind of competitive in competing when it comes to things. She's more worried about what's going to benefit her than she wants. And Kimberly, we're kind of like more accommodating, more willing to cooperate with things to come to solutions where everyone kind of benefits from the
Yeah. So, right, this gets at our discussion earlier this week where we were talking about different conflict management styles. We talked a little bit about that last week as well. But you might recall, right, in a lot of Western cultures, there's a greater emphasis on competition and individual achievement. Doing well and there being really clear winners and losers in a conflict. So Nancy might approach that in that kind of way. Kimberly says, conflict is more about building harmony and having group members agree with one another. In other words, the relationships might matter more than the thing that people are trying to vie for. If it's like a position for a job, or it's how to split up, pizza or something like that, right? So depending on the culture that somebody might come from, their priorities in conflict could look a little bit different. So an individualistic culture, remember, is one that's focused on more individualistic achievement. So, career goals, life goals, and so on. So countries such as the United States, Great Britain, right, are a lot more focused on individualistic culture. Whereas collectivist culture, right, is more common in places such as Japan or Korea. So collectivistic cultures are much more concerned with forming meaningful relationships among members of the group and are more concerned with things such as harmony among the group's members rather than the group itself having particular solutions to problems. And then the last part of this question gets at the role of mediation, right? So Kimberly and Nancy decide to hire John, who's a mediator. So this is the trickier part of the question, and one that ties to the chapter 4 of Jant. This is about how a mediator is more likely to be accepted, especially as an outsider in more individualistic cultures, right? So a lot of times we see a conflict as intractable, you can't solve the conflict, like, you have a divorce attorney or something like that. They come in and they offer this kind of neutral perspective. They say, this is how it's done, this is how we're going to resolve the issue. There's a lot of reasons for this. One of the big reasons is that because people are competing for something, they kind of think there's no way out, there's no solution to this issue. So let's have another person who solved the problem for us. Another reason this might be common in an individualistic culture is the idea of neutrality, that being a good thing. Somebody that doesn't know the issue and can approach something objectively might be seen as a really good thing. And still another reason why an individualistic culture might use a mediator more as an outsider is because it might help them towards something like collaboration, right? So collaboration takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to do, especially if you're focused on individual achievement. It's a lot harder to develop these collaborative solutions to problems. We don't necessarily have the same kind of training or work or preparation that lets us do those effectively. Whereas in a more collectivistic culture, right, generally speaking, we value mediators who are insiders, people who understand and care about the people involved in the conflict. That is, if you're outside and you don't know what's going on, and you don't understand the context, that can pose a really big issue. One big difference here that can help to shape this is the difference between high and low context culture, right? So high context culture is basically culture in which there is a lot of subtext, and what is said and expressed verbally does not tell the whole story. So for instance, if somebody is saying something, the things like their eye contact, their gestures, their facial expressions, their tone, and so on, can mean something totally different, right? So for instance, Mandarin Chinese, that language, not only the sounds, but the particular tone and emphasis placed on those sounds can mean incredibly different things as a sentence is being said, right? So that could be an example of high context. Whereas low context cultures are ones in which the communication is a lot more direct, what you say is what you mean, and there are fewer things that get lost in translation. So in my interpersonal communication class, we've been talking about nonverbal communication being ambiguous, right? When you're rolling your eyes or when it's unclear if you're being sincere or sarcastic, those are challenging to pick up on, especially among different cultures. So a mediator might be desired as an insider in a collectivistic culture because collectivistic cultures might be more high context. There's more specifics and details about the relationship and the conflict that need to be understood for the conflict to be resolved, right? If there is a major family disagreement about an arranged marriage, right, an insider who understands the dynamics of that relationship can be there to help that discussion. An outsider who doesn't understand what's going on and is not going to approach a good solution. So, as you're thinking about this question that I asked you to work on for today, you might consider how difficult key concepts and ideas were, right? What is it within this question you might be interested in going back to review or get more information on? You might also think about the amount of time that it took you to finish the question. Seems like a lot of people were able to finish maybe with a few minutes to spare. That's great. If it felt like it took longer for you, you might think about working through the multiple choice questions more quickly, and so on. We'll have another one of these before we get to the midterm exam. It's a way to kind of review and help you to prepare for that one too. So again, culture, right? It gets at the rules that we play by. So Clifford Geertz is kind of a famous anthropologist and cultural theorist who wrote a piece called Deep Play, Notes on Balinese Cockfight. If you've taken anthropology or sociology class, you might be familiar with this one. Essentially, Geertz goes to Bali for an extended period of time. He does an ethnography of the Balinese people, and in particular, he focuses on Balinese cockfighting, which is actually this incredibly deep and sophisticated and huge part of Balinese culture. There are so many unwritten rules about how to place bets on essentially how to prepare the birds to fight on the different arenas and so on, right? And we can talk about the ethics of that. But the interesting component of this are all of the rules and the ideas that have been passed down and shared through things like oral history over time, right? Culture are these thoughts, experiences, and behaviors. So doing something like cockfighting is a big part of that, right? The types of sports that you play or that you're interested in. Maybe it's your family background, and your family feels strongly about the Oregon Ducks and supporting the University of Oregon, right? That can affect your culture and your identity. It also brings about, right, concepts, values, and assumptions about life that can guide people within that group. One example of this, right, is that for many indigenous populations, there are unique kind of creation stories. Right? How was the sun created? How are various animal and plant species created, and so on. And so these stories are passed down generationally and very much shape a unique culture and its identity. So culture, again, is this idea of these shared experiences. Geertz was very much trying to understand how, in countries such as Bali, these kinds of practices were happening. And so the study of culture through things like ethnography or observation is a big way that we understand how different cultures behave, right? So culture is interesting on its own, but I think culture is especially relevant when we place it in this class in the context of conflict, right? So we have this conflict grid that you probably noticed for this chapter. And there's this question of whether or not the person has the same kind of cultural attitudes and behavior as the other person, and whether or not somebody believes that culture is, believes positively or negatively about that culture, right? So the interactions and conflict that we have with different people look very different. If it's intracultural conflict, right? So intracultural conflict is conflict within members of the same culture. So if you and a teammate or colleague or family member are having a discussion, it's probably a lot more high context and there are more specifics that you two are able to discuss, and there's less ambiguity that might come about from cultural differences. If the cultural background of somebody is very different than what you're expecting, then you might find that there's greater difficulty in sharing thoughts and ideas. Even things like gestures can feel very different too, right? Nodding versus shaking your head can actually mean the opposite of what it means in the United States, where sometimes shaking your head can actually mean yes, vice versa. So the expectation that we have of another culture or somebody that we're in conflict with versus the way that somebody might actually behave essentially sets up this quadrant of differences that we might see. Again, as I mentioned before, individualistic cultures tend to prefer more top-down negotiation, right? They tend to prefer this neutral third party that makes the decisions or decides how to resolve the issue, whereas collectivistic cultures tend to prefer these kind of collaborative approaches that involve a mediator being a part of the discussion without having necessarily the same level of authority. So that kind of reviews a lot of the things that were related to that exam. We also, as a reminder for last class, talked about culture deconstructing. So I asked you to share these 3 different approaches, the wheres, along with the conflict map and so on. We looked at the code access pipeline as an example of a case study where we can deconstruct and analyze the different parts of the conflict. So today, right, we've had the chance to go over the practice question, talk a little bit about culture and its role in conflict management. We're going to do a deeper dive into culture, some of the ways we can understand, define, and use examples to make sense of culture a little bit more on Monday. But I do want to take remaining time for today to brainstorm for the study circle assignment. So as a reminder, the study circle is coming up for at least a couple groups. So if you're a member of study circle group number 1, you are scheduled to do your study circle in class on Wednesday. Remember, that's a half-hour time just during the class where you're there and you'll be participating in this conversation. Other folks in the class will be watching, taking notes, observing, right? You'll be able to be here and do that study circle if you're in group number 1 on Wednesday. And then if you're group number 2, you'll do that the following Friday. And the 3rd and 4th study circle groups are a little bit later. As a reminder, that assignment has 3 different parts, right? Part 1 is that you participate in the conversation on your topic. Part 2 is that within 2 weeks of completing the study circle, you have a reflection where you talk about the experience. And then for part 3, I'm asking you to provide some feedback on a couple other of the study circles that happened in the class. If you're not able to make the class, right, to see other people, then those recordings will also be available for you to watch. If something comes up, like quarantine, and you're not able to attend your own study circle, I will help to kind of reschedule you there. So, I am going to be posting the topics for your study circles later today, but I do want to give you the chance to start to brainstorm and think about topics. What I'd like you to do is take some time, chat with members of your study circle. The first thing to do is to figure out who's going to take on the role of a facilitator, right? So the facilitator is the person that doesn't necessarily share a strong opinion, but is the person that helps to guide and direct the discussion. So if you like taking on that kind of role where you're saying, hey, all right, let's move on to the next point, or I haven't heard not much from you, why don't you say this or that? You can take on that role. You might think about what sort of topics your group is interested in discussing, right? So that's the sticky part, right, is figuring out a topic where your group members might not entirely agree, but your group members feel comfortable talking about this issue. So for instance, should kindergarten or preschool be free? Is getting a college degree worth it? Should we increase or decrease our timber use in the state of Oregon? Should we use things such as controlled burns or fires, right? Those are kind of topics to consider. What I'd like you to do is, when you're talking with your discussion groups about that, figure out who's going to take on that facilitator role and start to jot down the topics that your group members might have, and I'll use that to help to figure out which topic your group will do. So why don't we have the discussion study circle number 1. I'll post the Canvas page for that as well, so that's easier for you to see. So as I'm getting that ready, you might want to think about, do you have strong opinions, yes or no, on being a facilitator?
Your EDU one.
Oh, thank you. You might also think about if there are topics that you feel strongly about. Again, as a reminder, the study circles that we have here. So if you're in study circle 1, why don't you come up here to this corner? So Cody, Angela, and Joe, Rena, Logan, and Patty. You're in study circle number 2. So Dawn, Stormy, Grace, Ambrosia, Jamie, and Casey. Come up here to this corner. If you're study circle number 3, so that's Jonah, Clayton, Ellie, Oliver, Chad, and Abby. Come back to this corner here. And then Calvin, Sarah, Brooke, Brian, and Shane. Down to this corner here on the end. Oh, gotcha. Yeah. So if you've got people that aren't here, that's okay. Do what you can with the folks that are here, yeah, we can go from there.
Like, you make a list of
Dr. Mann?
Yeah.
Can you put the groups up real quick again? Just
Yep.
make it smaller people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know a lot of you don't have everybody here. That's okay.
Yeah, I think like the best you don't call.
Yes.
Ryan and Shane.
And in terms of like how controversial your topic should be, right? I think that really comes down to the comfort of your group. It might not be something everybody agrees on, but it doesn't have to be like so intense that people feel really uncomfortable. So you might find a topic where it's like, you know, there's some disagreement, or it is something you want to talk about further, but not something that, you know, would make you feel uncomfortable in the class. If you have no strong topic preferences, you can let me know too, and I'm happy to just assign you one.
Yeah. Can you give us a few more ideas?
Sure. So, you know, there's the topics about, like I was mentioning about like timber and personal burns, right? There's topics about like whether or not like an online education or degree can accomplish or do the same things in person. There's you know, topics. I mean, some of the larger like national level topics are things too. For instance, minimum wage in the United States, whether or not there should be like a universal basic income, to what degree should our like foreign policy be isolationist versus more active or interventionist, You know, should we abolish the electoral college and do like a winner takes all system, right? Like those are the kind of larger scale national topics that you might think about too. You know, you might think about additional issues that are impacting the state of Oregon. So for instance, you know, things such as like rural versus urban concerns, right? To what degree is Eastern Oregon being represented or considered in the context of issues affecting the state as a whole? Those are a couple additional ideas that immediately come to mind. Yeah.
Dealing with that right.
Oh, wow, yeah, okay.
Any of those stand out to you? I agree with you, but I don't know if anybody else feels so. I don't know what it
So what I'll do is, if you're still trying to brainstorm or think about questions, I'll give you, you know, if you want to send anything else to me within the next hour or two, through email or anything else, like, you know, you're talking with your group and you realize, oh, I have another idea. You're welcome to send that my way. But why don't we go ahead and if you can pass forward both your group's ideas and then also the essay, short essay that you did for today. I'll grab those for today's attendance. If you weren't able to come up with anything, that's okay. If you do get an idea within like the next couple hours or so, you can email that to me. Otherwise, I can just kind of assign you a topic.
Same tile.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, so I'll give some additional time for you to either email me if you have additional ideas, or for group members that were not able to attend to submit ideas to. So thanks so much for working on this short essay and working together in your groups on this. Again, I'm excited for this as an opportunity for us to apply these skills in conflict management. No new reading for Monday's class. Instead, refresh on Janet chapter 4 if you haven't done so already. Make sure you understand the study circle guidelines, especially presenting. We'll talk about a little bit more what makes up a culture and some more examples of culture and conflict. So have a great weekend, and I'll be posting the topics over the weekend, and I will see you all again on Monday.
We didn't come up with a lot, and we only had 2 words, so I don't know.
Okay, that's okay.
And we're not very big weeks, so I don't know if like,
Sure.
yeah.
I'm gonna open it up for people to like email or send me additional ideas that they have.
That'd be
So
awesome, 'cause I'm like,
yeah.
I don't even know what to do for.
that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah,
Well,
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Do you guys want to be added to it too? Before, like, you know?
Okay, here's the, do you just want to look together? Okay.
So great. Thanks so much, Jamie.
Okay, I can